Orphaned teen rescues abandoned puppy, never suspecting it would lead him to his long-lost sister. The words had haunted Ethan James since that rainy October night when his life splintered into before and after. Now, 6 months later, the 17-year-old stood at the edge of Riverdale Park, hands thrust deep in the pockets of a jacket 2 sizes too large, a hand-me-down from a foster home he'd long since left behind. Rain pattered against his hood, each drop a small, cold reminder of his solitude. The sky had opened up without warning, driving everyone else from the park, leaving only Ethan and his thoughts. He preferred it this way. People asked too many questions, expected too many answers he didn't have. 3 foster homes in 6 months. A new record, even for him. The latest family had been nice enough. Clean house, regular meals, minimal drama. But they'd looked at him with the same expression everyone wore around him. A mixture of pity and uncertainty, as if he were a complicated math problem they couldn't quite solve. Ethan kicked at a puddle, watching the ripples expand outward. 17 was a terrible age to be alone. Too old for the cute adoption track, too young to fully stand on his own. The social worker spoke in hushed tones about aging out of the system, as if it were a fate worse than what he'd already endured. The memory surfaced unbidden. His mother's smile across the dinner table, his father's deep laugh, his little sister Emma's pigtails bouncing as she danced around the kitchen. Gone. All gone in a single night of screeching tires and shattered glass. The accident had taken his parents immediately. Emma had vanished into the system before Ethan even woke up in the hospital, separated by the cold efficiency of overworked social services and distant relatives who couldn't or wouldn't take both children. "I'll find you," he'd promised the empty air of his hospital room. "I swear, Em, I'll find you." But promises were easier made than kept, especially by a 14-year-old with a broken arm and nowhere to go. 3 years of searching had yielded nothing but dead ends and sealed records. A sound cut through the drumming of rain on leaves, faint, almost lost beneath the ambient noise of distant traffic. Ethan paused, head tilting slightly. There it came again, a whimper, small and frightened. Following the sound, Ethan moved deeper into the park, past the abandoned playground with its rain-slicked slides and empty swings, swaying in the breeze. The whimpering grew more distinct as he approached a cluster of bushes beside an overflowing trash can. Crouching down, Ethan pushed aside the wet branches. 2 eyes, round and terrified, stared back at him from the shadows. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. The puppy, for that's what it was, a small bundle of matted fur no bigger than a loaf of bread, pressed itself farther into the bushes. Its thin body trembled violently, whether from cold or fear, Ethan couldn't tell. Probably both. "I'm not going to hurt you," Ethan murmured, extending his hand slowly, palm up. The puppy's ribs showed clearly through its dirty coat, and a makeshift collar of frayed rope was tied too tightly around its neck. "Someone did a number on you, huh?" The puppy whined again, but didn't retreat further. Progress of sorts. Ethan glanced around the empty park, rain streaming down his face. No sign of an owner. No indication that anyone was looking for this creature. Just another throwaway like him. "Guess we're both having a bad day." Ethan shrugged out of his oversized jacket, ignoring the immediate chill that seeped through his thin t-shirt. "Come on, let's get you out of the rain." Moving with deliberate slowness, he wrapped the jacket around the trembling animal, who offered only token resistance before going limp in his arms. The puppy was light, too light, and Ethan could feel its heart racing against his chest as he cradled it. "You and me now, buddy," he whispered, turning back toward the street. "At least for tonight." His current foster placement, the Shaw family, had a strict no-pets policy, like most of the places he'd stayed. But Mrs. Shaw would be working the night shift at the hospital, and Mr. Shaw barely left his home office. One night of hiding a puppy couldn't be that hard. As Ethan walked, the rain began to ease, and the puppy's trembling gradually subsided. Small paws pressed against his chest, seeking warmth, seeking connection. Something unfamiliar expanded in Ethan's chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. Hope, maybe, or purpose. The weight of this small life in his arms anchored him in a way nothing had since the accident. "You need a name," Ethan said as they approached the row of identical suburban houses where he temporarily resided. "Something better than Buddy." The puppy's head emerged from the jacket, ears perked slightly, as if considering this important matter. "How about Lucky?" Ethan suggested, then shook his head. "No, too obvious." "Chic or Chance?" "Nah, sounds like a cologne." He studied the dog's face. a scruffy mix of unknown breeds with one ear that flopped over while the other stood straight up. Despite everything, there was something resilient in those eyes. Survivor? Too dramatic. The puppy licked his hand suddenly, a quick warm dart of affection that startled a laugh from Ethan. "Scout," he decided. "You look like a scout to me." Scout responded by snuggling deeper into the jacket as Ethan carefully made his way up the side entrance of the Shaw house, avoiding the front door with its creaky hinge that would alert Mr. Shaw to his arrival. Ethan's room was the smallest in the house, formerly a storage space converted into a bedroom when the Shaws decided to become foster parents for the monthly stipend. It held a twin bed, a dresser with 3 drawers, and a narrow desk pushed against the window. Not much, but it was private, and privacy was a luxury in foster care. Setting Scout down on the bed, Ethan unwrapped his jacket and got his first good look at his new companion. The puppy was even smaller than he'd realized, probably no more than a few months old. Its coat might have been golden under all the dirt, with white patches on its chest and paws. One eye was swollen half shut, and the rope collar had rubbed the fur away, leaving a raw ring around its neck. "First things first," Ethan muttered, pulling a pair of scissors from his desk drawer. Scout flinched at the metallic snip but held still as Ethan carefully cut away the cruel restraint. "There we go. Better already." A quick check of the hallway confirmed that Mr. Shaw was still secluded in his office, the glow of his computer screen visible under the door. Ethan slipped into the bathroom, wetting a washcloth with warm water and grabbing a small towel. Back in his room, he gently began cleaning Scout's fur. "You're a mess, you know that?" he said quietly as he worked. Scout endured the impromptu bath with surprising patience, only occasionally squirming when Ethan touched a tender spot. "I should probably take you to a vet or something. But that costs money, which is..." He trailed off, mentally calculating the $27.43 he had saved from odd jobs mowing lawns in the neighborhood. Short supply. As the dirt washed away, Ethan discovered more about his new friend. Scout was indeed golden-furred with distinctive white markings. A boy, probably a retriever mix of some kind, with a crescent-shaped black patch over one eye like a pirate's. And he was young, very young, with soft puppy fur and oversized paws he hadn't grown into yet. "You hungry? I bet you're hungry." Ethan rummaged through his backpack, producing half a sandwich saved from lunch. Scout devoured it in seconds, then looked up expectantly, tail wagging for the first time. "That's all for now, buddy. We'll figure out something better tomorrow." As night fell, Ethan fashioned a makeshift bed from an old sweatshirt on the floor beside his bed. But Scout had other ideas. The moment Ethan lay down, the puppy scrambled up beside him, curling into the crook of his arm with a contented sigh. "This is temporary, you know," Ethan warned, even as his hand stroked the now clean fur. "I can't keep you. I can barely keep myself." Scout responded by licking his hand again before settling his head on Ethan's chest, eyes closing in perfect trust. For the first time in months, Ethan slept without nightmares. Morning arrived with a shaft of sunlight and the insistent nudging of a cold nose against his cheek. Ethan blinked awake to find Scout standing on his chest, tail wagging enthusiastically. Okay, I'm up," Ethan mumbled, glancing at his alarm clock. 6:17 a.m., earlier than he'd voluntarily woken up in months. The house was still quiet. Mrs. Shaw would have returned from her night shift and gone straight to bed, and Mr. Shaw rarely emerged before 9. The immediate problem presented itself when Scout began circling anxiously on the bed. "Oh, right." Ethan quickly pulled on jeans and a hoodie. "Outside. You need to go outside." Sneaking a puppy out of the house proved easier than expected. Scout seemed to understand the need for stealth, padding quietly beside Ethan down the stairs and out the side door into the dewy morning. The neighborhood was still sleeping, curtains drawn against the early light. Ethan led Scout to a small patch of grass between houses, then watched with amusement as the puppy did his business with great concentration, as if it were the most important task in the world. Good job," Ethan whispered, feeling ridiculous for praising such a mundane act, yet unable to stop himself. "Very impressive." Scout looked up at him with what Ethan could swear was pride, then suddenly froze, ears perked towards something across the street. Following the puppy's gaze, Ethan spotted an elderly woman emerging from the blue house on the corner, a house he'd passed countless times without really noticing. She was tiny, wrapped in a cardigan despite the mild spring morning, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Something about her careful movements as she bent to retrieve her newspaper made Ethan step back, not wanting to be seen with his contraband puppy. Too late. The woman straightened, newspaper in hand, and looked directly at them. Even from across the street, Ethan could see her face light up at the sight of Scout. "What a beautiful dog," she called, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so small. Ethan froze, weighing his options. Running would look suspicious. Ignoring her would be rude. Reluctantly, he raised a hand in awkward greeting. The woman didn't wait for further invitation. Setting her newspaper on the porch step, she crossed the street with measured steps, her eyes never leaving Scout, who, traitor that he was now wagging his entire body in anticipation of meeting this new person. "Hello," she said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Ruth Winters." She didn't extend her hand, seeming to sense Ethan's wariness. "Ethan," he replied, deliberately omitting his last name, a habit formed from too many transitions. "I'm staying with the Shaws." He nodded toward the house behind him. "Ah, Linda and Thomas." Ruth nodded. "Good people, though Thomas works too much." Her attention returned to Scout, who was straining toward her, tail whipping the air. "And who is this handsome fellow?" "Scout," Ethan said, surprising himself with the proprietary tone in his voice. I just found him yesterday." Ruth knelt slowly, her movements those of someone who knew the language of animals. Scout immediately approached, sniffing her outstretched hand before pressing his head against it, demanding scratches. "He's undernourished," Ruth observed, her fingers gently probing Scout's sides. "And this eye needs attention. Have you had him checked by a vet?" "Not yet," Ethan admitted. "I just found him last night in Riverdale Park. Someone had tied him up with rope and abandoned him." Ruth's face darkened momentarily. Some people shouldn't be allowed near animals. She looked up at Ethan, her blue eyes sharp and assessing. Or children, for that matter. Something in her direct gaze made Ethan shift uncomfortably. It was as if she could see past his carefully constructed walls to the hurt beneath. "Do the Shaws know about him?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Not exactly," Ethan admitted. "I'm working on a plan." Ruth nodded, continuing to pet Scout, who had now rolled onto his back in complete surrender. "Plans are good, but sometimes puppies need more immediate solutions." She stood with a slight wince that betrayed aging joints. "I happen to know a veterinarian who owes me several favors. And I have a very secure backyard where a young dog might exercise safely while certain plans are being developed." Ethan stared at her, suspicion warring with desperate need for help. "Why would you do that?" "You don't even know me." Ruth's smile deepened, creasing her face into a map of lived experiences. "I know enough. I know you're out at dawn walking a puppy you rescued instead of leaving it to fend for itself. I know you've cleaned him up and earned his trust." She glanced toward the Shaw house. "And I know that finding safe harbor matters, especially when you're young." The words hit too close to home, and Ethan looked away, focusing on Scout, who was now investigating Ruth's slippered feet with great interest. "I can't pay for a vet," he said finally. "Did I mention payment?" Ruth countered mildly. "I said my friend owes me favors. Many favors." A window opened in the Shaw house and Ethan tensed. "I should get back before they notice I'm gone." Ruth nodded. "Bring Scout to the Blue House after school today. Number 47, right across the street. We'll sort things out." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Ethan, it might be wise to bring whatever you've been feeding him. Puppies do better with consistent diets." With that, she retrieved her newspaper and returned to her house, leaving Ethan staring after her, Scout leaning against his leg as if they'd been companions for years rather than hours. "Well, what just happened?" Ethan asked the puppy, who responded by attempting to chew his shoelace. Sneaking Scout back into the house proved more challenging than sneaking him out. Mr. Shaw was in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, eyebrows rising at the sight of Ethan coming through the side door. "Early riser today?" he asked, his tone casual but eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Thought I'd get some fresh air before school," Ethan replied, angling his body to block the view of Scout, who he'd hastily tucked inside his hoodie. The puppy, thankfully, seemed to understand the need for stillness, though Ethan could feel his rapid heartbeat against his stomach. Mr. Shaw sipped his coffee. "Linda mentioned there's leftover casserole in the fridge if you want breakfast." "Thanks." Ethan edged toward the stairs, maintaining what he hoped was a casual pace. Once safely back in his room, he released Scout onto the bed and exhaled heavily. That was close. Too close. The next challenge was school. 8 hours away from his room, 8 hours where Scout could bark, chew something, or otherwise reveal his presence. Inspiration struck as Ethan eyed his closet. Pushing aside his meager collection of clothes, he arranged his extra blanket into a nest on the floor, then placed his water bottle in a shallow dish beside it. "Temporary accommodations," he told Scout, who was watching the preparations with head tilted curiously. "Be good. Be quiet. I'll be back as soon as I can." Scout responded by hopping into the makeshift bed and turning 3 circles before settling down, looking up at Ethan with complete trust that nearly broke something inside him. "Don't make me regret this," Ethan whispered, closing the closet door just enough to allow air but not escape. School passed in an agonizing blur. Ethan's body sat through classes, his pencil occasionally making notes, but his mind remained in his closet with Scout. By the final bell, he'd constructed and discarded a dozen different plans, each more unlikely than the last. When he finally returned home, taking the stairs 2 at a time while Mrs. Shaw called something about homework from the kitchen, he half expected disaster. Instead, he found Scout exactly where he'd left him, curled up on the blanket, though the water dish was empty and there was a suspicious damp spot in one corner. "Good boy," Ethan breathed, gathering the puppy into his arms. Scout's entire body wiggled with joy at his return, small whimpers of happiness escaping, despite Ethan's whispered pleas for quiet. "We need to go," Ethan said, glancing at his watch. Mrs. Shaw would be starting dinner soon, and Mr. Shaw would emerge from his office for his evening news program. The window for sneaking Scout out was closing rapidly. Tucking the puppy once again inside his hoodie, Ethan made it downstairs and called out, "Going to study at the library. Back for dinner," before Mrs. Shaw could emerge from the kitchen where he could hear pots clanging. "Be home by 6:30. She called back, her standard response that required no actual interaction. Perfect. The blue house across the street looked different in the afternoon light. Smaller perhaps, but with a neat garden of early spring flowers along the walkway and curtains that glowed warmly from within. Ethan hesitated at the gate, second thoughts crowding in. What did he really know about Ruth Winters? What if this was some kind of trap? Scout made the decision for him, squirming to be put down. Once on the ground, the puppy trotted confidently up the path as if he'd been there 100 times before, looking back at Ethan with an expression that clearly asked why he wasn't following. "Fine," Ethan muttered. "But if this goes badly, I'm blaming you." The door opened before he could knock. Ruth stood there in the same cardigan as that morning, though she'd changed her slippers for proper shoes. "Right on time," she said, as if they'd made a specific appointment rather than a vague suggestion. "Come in, both of you." The interior of Ruth's house felt like stepping into another era. Furniture that was clearly older than Ethan but meticulously maintained. Photographs in simple frames, bookshelves lined with actual books, not decorative objects, and an overwhelming sense of stability, as if nothing here had changed in decades, nor needed to. Scout immediately began exploring, nose to the ground, following scent trails invisible to humans. "He seems to be feeling at home already," Ruth observed, closing the door behind them. "That's good. Animals know when they're in a safe place." Ethan remained standing awkwardly just inside the entryway, hands shoved in his pockets. "You mentioned a vet? Dr. Miller is expecting us in half an hour," Ruth confirmed. "His clinic is just a few blocks away. We can walk there." She gestured toward the living room. "But first, you might want to sit down. You look like you haven't rested properly in days." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Ethan had been sleeping poorly long before Scout entered his life, though last night had been an exception. "I'm fine standing," he said, then immediately felt rude. "I mean, thanks, but we probably shouldn't stay long." Ruth regarded him steadily. "Ethan, I'm 78 years old. I've lived in this house for 53 of those years. In that time, I've learned that most problems look different once you've sat down with a cup of tea." Without waiting for his response, she moved into the kitchen, leaving Ethan to either follow or stand awkwardly in the entryway. After a moment's hesitation, he trailed after her, finding Scout already there, investigating a ceramic water bowl that hadn't been there that morning. "You were pretty confident I'd come," Ethan observed, nodding toward the bowl. Ruth filled a kettle at the sink. "I was confident that puppy needed help, and you seem like someone who follows through on commitments." She placed the kettle on the stove. Whether that included accepting help from a stranger was less certain, but I found it's best to be prepared either way. Something about her matter-of-fact tone disarmed Ethan's usual defenses. He found himself sitting at the small kitchen table while Ruth moved efficiently around the space, gathering mugs and tea bags. Scout, having thoroughly examined the kitchen, returned to Ethan's side and flopped down on his feet with a contented sigh. "He's attached to you already," Ruth noted, setting a steaming mug in front of Ethan. "That's significant. Dogs are excellent judges of character. He's just grateful I got him out of the rain." Ethan demurred, though he couldn't help the small surge of pride her words evoked. "Perhaps," Ruth allowed, settling across from him with her own mug. But gratitude and trust aren't the same thing. One is a response to a single action, the other is an assessment of character. She sipped her tea. Scout trusts you. Ethan stared down at his mug, uncomfortable with both the observation and the unexpected lump in his throat. I can't keep him, he said finally. The Shaws don't allow pets, and I don't even know how long I'll be there. Yes, foster placements can be unpredictable, Ruth agreed. Ethan's head snapped up. How did you? Linda Shaw mentioned it when she first moved in, Ruth explained. She and Thomas became foster parents last year. You're their third placement, I believe. The casual way she referenced his situation, as if being a foster kid was just a neutral fact rather than a defining characteristic, caught Ethan off guard. Most adults either avoided the topic entirely or spoke about it in hushed, pitying tones. Fourth, he corrected automatically. They had a younger kid for about 2 weeks before me. Ruth nodded, accepting the correction without comment. In any case, we should focus on immediate concerns. Scout needs medical attention, proper food, and a safe place to stay. She set down her mug. I'm offering my backyard and supervision during the day while you're at school. You'd be welcome to visit him here anytime. Why? The question escaped before Ethan could stop it. Why would you do all this for a stray dog and some random kid you just met? Ruth's expression softened. Because 47 years ago, someone did something similar for me when I needed it most. She rose from the table. Finish your tea. We should head to Dr. Miller's soon. The veterinary clinic was a small storefront wedged between a hardware store and a laundromat. A bell jingled as they entered, and Scout pressed himself against Ethan's legs, suddenly nervous at the antiseptic smell and unfamiliar surroundings. Ruth! A balding man in his 50s emerged from the back, arms outstretched. Right on time, as always. Daniel. Ruth accepted a brief hug. Thank you for fitting us in. Dr. Wasseranyerwam. Miller turned his attention to Ethan and Scout. And this must be the emergency patient I've heard about. He crouched down, extending his hand for Scout to sniff. Hello there, young fellow. The examination that followed was thorough, but gentle. Scout endured it with surprising patience, only whimpering when the doctor carefully examined his swollen eye. Mild infection. Doctor, Miller pronounced. Nothing some antibiotics won't clear up. He's underweight and has some minor abrasions from that improvised collar, but otherwise he's in remarkably good shape for a stray. He glanced up at Ethan. You did well, getting him out of that situation. Just happened to be there. Ethan mumbled, uncomfortable with the praise. Sometimes being there is all it takes. Doctor, Miller replied, straightening up. Now let's talk vaccinations, nutrition, and preventative care. What followed was a crash course in puppy ownership. Shots, deworming medication, dietary recommendations, and training suggestions. Doctor, Miller spoke directly to Ethan, not around him to Ruth as many adults might have done, and provided clear explanations for each procedure and prescription. Any questions? The vet asked finally after Scout had been thoroughly poked, prodded, and injected. Ethan hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at him since they arrived. How much is all this going to cost? Doctor, Miller and Ruth exchanged a look that Ethan couldn't quite interpret. Consider it covered. Doctor, Miller said firmly. Ruth and I have an arrangement. But, young man, the vet interrupted gently. In my profession, we occasionally provide services pro bono for rescues in special cases. Scout qualifies as both. He handed Ethan a small bag containing medications and puppy food samples. My payment is seeing animals get the second chances they deserve. That's all you need to worry about. Outside the clinic, the spring evening had settled into a gentle dusk. Scout, apparently exhausted by his medical adventure, leaned heavily against Ethan's leg as they walked. Dr. Horney Wawarna-1, serving Horney. Miller seems nice, Ethan ventured, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between him and Ruth. He is, Ruth agreed. His daughter was my student many years ago. I taught 5th grade for 36 years before retiring. Is that how he owes you favors? You taught his kid? Ruth's laugh was unexpectedly bright in the gathering darkness. No, though that might have been enough. The favors stem from something else entirely. She paused at a crosswalk. Daniel's wife left him 20 years ago. It was a difficult time for him. I had a spare room and a good listening ear. Ethan absorbed this, trying to reconcile the confident veterinarian with someone who might have needed help. So you just Take in strays. Human ones too? I prefer to think of it as recognizing when people need a safe harbor. Ruth corrected gently. Everyone does at some point. They walked the rest of the way in silence, Scout growing increasingly sleepy between them. By the time they reached Ruth's house, the puppy was practically asleep on his feet. You should get him settled in the backyard before heading home for dinner, Ruth suggested, checking her watch. It's nearly 6:15. The backyard, accessed through a side gate, revealed another surprise. A small doghouse had been placed under the shelter of an apple tree, with a soft bed visible inside and a water bowl nearby. Like everything else about Ruth's home, it was neat, practical, and clearly prepared with care. When did you? Ethan began, staring at the setup. I mentioned I like to be prepared, Ruth reminded him. The doghouse belonged to my last companion, Jasper. He passed away 2 years ago at the respectable age of 14. A shadow of old grief crossed her face. He was a good dog. I think he'd approve of it being used again. Ethan gently placed Scout inside the doghouse, where the puppy immediately curled up on the soft bedding with a contented sigh. Will he be okay out here alone? The yard is fully fenced, and the forecast is mild tonight, Ruth assured him. But if it makes you feel better, I sleep lightly, and my bedroom window overlooks this part of the garden. I'll hear him if he needs anything. Relief and gratitude warred with lingering suspicion in Ethan's mind. People didn't just do things like this. Not in his experience. There was always a catch, always an expectation, always eventual disappointment. I should go, he said abruptly. The Shaws will be waiting. Ruth nodded, seemingly unsurprised by his sudden shift in mood. You're welcome to come by tomorrow after school. The gate will be unlocked, and I'm usually home by 4. Thanks, Ethan managed, already backing away. For everything, I mean. With Scout. You're welcome, Ethan, Ruth said simply. Some things are just the right thing to do. Dinner with the Shaws passed in its usual fashion. Mrs. Shaw asking perfunctory questions about school, Mr. Shaw commenting on news events, and Ethan providing the minimum acceptable responses to both. His mind remained in Ruth's backyard with Scout, wondering if the puppy was lonely or afraid without him. Ethan, Mrs. Shaw's voice cut through his distraction. I asked if you've given any thought to the summer program the school counselor mentioned. The application deadline is next Friday. Oh, not really, Ethan admitted. Summer felt like a distant concern compared to his current situation. Mrs. Shaw sighed, exchanging one of those adult looks with her husband that spoke volumes without words. Well, you should. It would look good on college applications. College, another future concern that seemed laughably remote. Ethan nodded non-committally and focused on finishing his dinner as quickly as possible, without seeming rude. Later, lying in bed staring at his ceiling, Ethan found himself mapping out the next day's schedule around Scout. How early he'd need to wake up to visit before school, what excuse he could give to spend time at Ruth's afterward, whether he should try to save part of his lunch to bring for the puppy. It was strange to have something to plan for beyond just getting through each day. Strange, but not unwelcome. Sleep came easier than usual, though he missed the warm weight of Scout against his side. The next 2 weeks fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings began with an early visit to Ruth's backyard, where Scout's excitement at seeing him never failed to start the day on a positive note. School remained a necessary ordeal to be endured. Afternoons were spent at Ruth's house, where Ethan gradually moved from the edge of her garden to her kitchen table to, eventually, her comfortable living room. Scout thrived under their shared care. The infection cleared, his coat grew glossier, and his natural puppy exuberance emerged fully as he gained strength and confidence. He still followed Ethan like a shadow whenever possible, but he'd also developed a clear affection for Ruth, greeting her with the same full-body wiggle that had once been reserved only for his rescuer. He's looking more like a proper dog every day, Ruth observed on the 15th afternoon, watching Scout tear around the backyard in pursuit of a tennis ball Ethan had found. Yeah, Ethan agreed, unable to keep the pride from his voice. The vet said his weight is almost normal now. Ruth nodded, her hands busy with the knitting that seemed to be a constant companion during quiet moments. You've done well with him. Consistent care makes all the difference for the young, whether they have 4 legs or 2. Ethan had grown somewhat accustomed to Ruth's gentle wisdom, delivered in observations rather than lectures. Still, something about this particular comment struck a chord. I had that, he said suddenly. Before, consistent care. Ruth's knitting needles stilled, though her eyes remained on Scout's antics. I suspected as much. It shows in how you've cared for him. My parents were good people. Ethan continued, surprising himself with the need to make this clear. The accident, it wasn't anyone's fault. Just a rainy night and a driver who crossed the center line. I'm very sorry, Ethan, Ruth said simply. No platitudes about better places or divine plans, just a straightforward acknowledgement of loss. My sister survived too, he added, the words pushing past a tightness in his throat. Emma, she was 6. We got separated in the system. Different placements, different counties. I've been trying to find her, but the system isn't designed to facilitate such connections. Ruth finished for him, her voice carrying an edge he hadn't heard before. Particularly when the children don't have other family advocating for them. Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. Scout, perhaps sensing the shift in mood, abandoned his ball and trotted over, pressing his warm body against Ethan's legs. May I ask how long ago this happened? Ruth inquired gently. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Ethan answered without hesitation. Some dates were burned into memory. Ruth set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap. And in all that time, no one has helped you look for her? The question carried no judgment, but Ethan felt defensive nonetheless. I've tried. The social workers always say they can't give out information on other placements. Privacy policies or something. And I keep getting moved around, so it's hard to. He trailed off, aware of how much he was revealing to someone who, despite these daily interactions, was still essentially a stranger. To maintain any momentum in your search, Ruth completed his thought. Yes, I can see how that would be challenging. She was quiet for a moment, then. What do you remember about where she might have been placed? Ethan shrugged, scratching behind Scout's ears as the puppy leaned harder against him. Not much. I was still in the hospital when they moved her. Someone mentioned relatives on my mom's side showing interest, but they were from out of state. Ohio, maybe? Or Indiana? Ruth's expression sharpened slightly. Your mother's family name? Collins. Margaret Collins before she married my dad. Ethan frowned. Why? Just trying to understand the full picture. Ruth replied, though something in her tone suggested there was more to her interest. Would you recognize Emma if you saw her now? Children change quickly at that age. She'd be 9 now, Ethan said. But yeah, I'd know her. She has had this birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind her right ear. And her eyes are different colors, one blue, one hazel. Heterochromia, the doctors called it. Ruth nodded, reaching for her knitting again. Distinctive features. That's helpful. Helpful for what? Ethan asked, suddenly suspicious. You're not going to try to find her, are you? Because I've already tried everything I could think of. No, Ruth assured him, needles clicking rhythmically again. I was merely making conversation. Though I've found in my life that information has a way of being useful when you least expect it. The conversation shifted to Scout's training progress, and Ethan let the subject of Emma drop, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. That evening, as he prepared to leave, Ruth handed him a small paper bag. Some oatmeal cookies, she explained. I baked this morning and made too many for just myself. Ethan accepted the bag with a mumbled thanks, touched by the simple gesture. As he turned to go, Ruth added, Oh, and Ethan, I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow afternoon. If you could come by around 3 to let Scout out for a bit, I'd appreciate it. The spare key is under the blue pot by the back gate. Sure, Ethan agreed readily. No problem. It wasn't until he was halfway across the street that the implication fully registered. Ruth was trusting him with access to her home, even in her absence. The weight of that trust settled around his shoulders like an unfamiliar but not unwelcome garment. The following day at school dragged interminably. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan was practically vibrating with the need to check on Scout. He'd grown accustomed to the puppy's enthusiastic greetings, the unconditional joy his presence seemed to evoke in the small animal. As promised, the key was waiting under the blue flower pot. Ethan let himself into the backyard, calling Scout's name softly. No response. No golden blur racing around the corner of the house. No excited barking. Concern prickled along Ethan's spine. Had something happened? Was Scout sick? Had he somehow escaped? The doghouse was empty, the water bowl full but undisturbed. Ethan circled the yard, checking every corner, his concern mounting with each passing moment. Scout? He called again, louder this time. A muffled bark answered from inside the house. Relief flooded through Ethan, followed immediately by confusion. Ruth had said to let Scout out, implying he was in the backyard. But clearly the puppy was inside. Using the key again, Ethan cautiously entered through the back door, which opened directly into Ruth's kitchen. Hello? Scout? The pattering of paws on hardwood announced Scout's arrival seconds before the puppy himself appeared, tail wagging furiously, entire body vibrating with happiness at seeing Ethan. "Hey, buddy." Ethan crouched down, accepting Scout's enthusiastic face licks and paw scrabbling. "What are you doing inside, huh? Where's Ruth?" She had to step out. A voice answered from the doorway to the living room. Ethan's head snapped up, his body instinctively positioning itself between Scout and the unexpected presence. A girl stood there, young, maybe 9 or 10, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a wary expression that matched how Ethan felt. She wore jeans and a green t-shirt with some kind of science logo on it, and she was holding a half-eaten apple in one hand. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, rising to his feet. Where's Ruth?" "Doctor's appointment," the girl replied, taking a deliberate bite of her apple. "She said you'd be by to check on the dog." "Scout," Ethan corrected automatically. "His name is Scout," the girl shrugged. "Whatever. Ruth said I should stay inside until she gets back. I'm supposed to be doing homework." She gestured vaguely toward the living room, where Ethan could now see a backpack and scattered papers on the coffee table. "That doesn't answer who you are," Ethan pointed out, relaxing slightly but still confused. Ruth had never mentioned another child in her life. The girl studied him for a long moment, head tilted slightly to one side. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the gesture, though Ethan couldn't place why. "I'm staying with Ruth for a while," she said finally. "I'm Emma." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Emma. It couldn't be, and yet, looking closer, he could see it now. The distinctive shape of her eyes, though they were half hidden behind unfamiliar glasses. The stubborn set of her chin that matched their father's. Even the way she stood, weight shifted slightly to one side, a stance his sister had adopted from their mother. "Emma?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Emma James?" The apple stopped halfway to her mouth. "How do you know my last name?" Ethan's legs suddenly felt incapable of supporting his weight. He sank onto one of Ruth's kitchen chairs, Scout pressing anxiously against his knees, sensing his distress. "Emma," he said again, unable to form any other words. The girl, Emma, his Emma, set her apple down carefully on the counter, her movements deliberate, controlled. "You're freaking me out. How do you know who I am?" "Behind your right ear," Ethan managed, his voice strangled. "There's a birthmark, shaped like a crescent moon." Emma's hand flew to the spot, covered now by her hair. Her eyes widened behind her glasses, and Ethan could see it now. One blue, one hazel, just as he remembered. "Who are you?" she whispered, but there was a tremor in her voice that suggested she might already know, or at least suspect. "Ethan," he said, his own name feeling strange on his tongue in this moment. "Your brother, Ethan." Emma took a step backward, bumping into the counter. "My brother is dead," she stated flatly. "They told me everyone died in the accident." The words landed like a blow. "What?" "No, Emma, I survived too. I was in the hospital for weeks, but I made it. They told me you were placed with relatives." "I was placed in foster care," Emma corrected, her voice taking on an edge of anger. "For 3 years. Different homes, different schools. No one ever mentioned a brother." "I've been looking for you," Ethan said desperately. "They wouldn't tell me where you were. I've asked every social worker, every foster parent. No one would help me find you." Emma's face was a storm of emotions: disbelief, hope, anger, confusion. "Prove it," she demanded suddenly. "Prove you're my brother." Ethan's mind raced. What could he possibly say that would convince her? What details would a 9-year-old remember about her 6-year-old self? "You had a stuffed rabbit," he began slowly. "Brown with one ear missing because you dragged it everywhere. You called it Mr. Flopsy, even though Mom tried to convince you that was too obvious a name for a rabbit." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "You were afraid of thunderstorms." Ethan continued, the memories flooding back now. "Dad used to build you a fort out of blankets in the living room when it rained, and we'd all sit inside with flashlights telling stories until you fell asleep." "Stop," Emma whispered, but Ethan couldn't stop now. "Your favorite ice cream was mint chocolate chip, but only if it was green. You wouldn't eat the white kind because you said it wasn't real. And you had this thing about your food not touching on the plate. Mom always had to get you those divided plates with sections." Tears were welling in Emma's eyes now, her hands clenched at her sides. "The last night," she said, her voice barely audible. "What did Dad say before we got in the car?" Ethan's breath caught. He remembered exactly, the moment preserved in perfect clarity, because it was the last thing he'd ever hear his father say. "Adventure awaits, my explorers," he quoted softly. He always said that before we went anywhere as a family. And you always answered, to infinity and beyond. Emma finished with him, her voice breaking on the last word. For a moment, they stared at each other across Ruth's kitchen. 3 years of separation stretching between them like an uncrossable chasm. Then Emma moved, closing the distance in 3 quick steps, flinging her arms around Ethan's waist and burying her face against his chest. Ethan, she sobbed, the name muffled against his shirt. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. His arms wrapped around her automatically, his brain still trying to process that this was real, that Emma, his little sister, was here, solid and alive in his arms. She was taller than he remembered, of course, but still small against him, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. I'm here, he whispered into her hair, his own tears falling freely now. I'm here, Em. I found you. They stood like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Scout circling anxiously around their feet, whining softly at the waves of emotion filling the room. Finally, Emma pulled back slightly, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. They told me you were dead, she repeated, her voice thick with lingering disbelief. All this time I thought I was alone. I'm so sorry, Ethan said, the inadequacy of the words burning in his throat. I tried to find you. I swear I tried. Ha, Sunir. How did you? Emma gestured vaguely around them, at Ruth's kitchen, at the improbability of their reunion. Scout, Ethan said, looking down at the puppy who had finally settled, pressed against both their legs as if trying to hold them together. I found him in the park, and he led me to Ruth, and somehow Ruth found you. As if summoned by her name, the back door opened, and Ruth stepped into the kitchen. She took in the scene before her, the tearful siblings, the protective puppy, and nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew. I see you two have had a chance to get reacquainted, she said simply. You knew, Ethan said, not a question but a statement. You knew who Emma was when I told you about her. Ruth set her purse on the counter with deliberate care. I suspected, she corrected. When you described her distinctive eyes and the birthmark, Emma arrived in the neighborhood 2 weeks ago, placed with the Hendersons 3 doors down. I volunteer at the community center where the local foster children have their supervised visits with birth families. I saw her file, but why didn't you tell me? Ethan asked, one arm still around Emma's shoulders, unwilling to break contact even to confront Ruth. Because I needed to be certain, Ruth replied evenly. And because some revelations need proper preparation for both parties. She looked at Emma. I needed to know that Emma was ready to hear that her brother was alive, just as I needed to confirm you were indeed her brother before raising hopes. So that's why you invited me over today? Emma asked, her voice steadier now, though she remained pressed against Ethan's side. And why you asked so many questions about my family? Ruth nodded. I arranged for you both to be here, yes. Though I admit, I had planned to be present for the initial reunion. My doctor's appointment ran longer than expected. Wait, Ethan frowned, trying to process everything. The Hendersons? Emma's staying 3 doors down? How is that possible? Not coincidence, if that's what you're asking, Ruth acknowledged. After our conversation about Emma, I made some calls. I still have connections in the school district and social services from my teaching days. When I learned that Emma was in the system and currently placed in another county, I suggested that the Hendersons might be an appropriate placement for her. You arranged for my sister to be moved here? Ethan's tone held equal parts awe and disbelief. Can you even do that? I merely provided information and a recommendation, Ruth said mildly. The decision was made by the appropriate authorities based on the Hendersons' excellent record as foster parents and their proximity to Emma's previous placement. Emma looked up at Ruth with newfound respect. You engineered this whole thing. A smile touched Ruth's lips. Engineered is perhaps too strong a word. I simply removed some obstacles and created an opportunity. The rest, she gestured between the siblings, was up to you. Scout barked suddenly, as if adding his own commentary to the conversation, which startled a laugh from Emma, a sound so achingly familiar that Ethan felt his heart might burst with it. And the puppy? Emma asked, crouching down to pet Scout. Was he part of your plan too? Scout was divine intervention, Ruth said with absolute seriousness. Or serendipity, if you prefer. The universe has its own ways of bringing together those who belong together. Ethan found himself unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. All the lonely months, the dead ends, the nights spent wondering if he'd ever see his sister again. And now here she was, kneeling beside the stray puppy that had somehow led him back to her. What happens now? He finally managed to ask, the question directed as much to the universe as to Ruth. Ruth settled into one of the kitchen chairs, gesturing for them to do the same. Now we have a conversation about next steps. You both need to know that while finding each other is a wonderful beginning, there are still challenges ahead. We're in different foster homes, Emma said, the reality setting in as she took a seat, Scout immediately resting his head on her lap. For now, Ruth agreed. But you're in the same neighborhood, attending schools in the same district. That's a significant improvement over being counties apart. Can we be placed together? Ethan asked, hope flaring despite his best efforts to temper it. Ruth's expression turned gentle but serious. That's a more complicated question. The system generally prefers to keep siblings together, but there are practical considerations. Availability of homes willing to take 2 children, one of whom is approaching adulthood. I'll be 18 in 7 months, Ethan acknowledged, the reality of his situation hanging heavy between them. Aging out of the system, as his social workers called it. No longer a ward of the state, but hardly prepared for independent living. I've been thinking about that as well, Ruth said, surprising him again. There are programs for transitional housing and support for foster youth entering adulthood. I've taken the liberty of gathering some information. She nodded toward a folder on the counter that Ethan hadn't noticed before. And in the meantime, Emma asked, her voice small, will we at least get to see each other? Every day if you wish, Ruth assured her. My home is open to both of you, anytime. And I suspect the Hendersons and the Shaws can be persuaded to allow sibling visits, particularly when properly supervised by a retired teacher with an impeccable reputation in the community. The calculated confidence in Ruth's tone made Ethan wonder just how many systems she had navigated in her 78 years. How many battles she had fought and won without ever raising her voice. Why are you doing all this for us? He asked suddenly. You barely know me and you just met Emma. Why go to all this trouble? Ruth was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting to a photograph on the wall. A much younger version of herself with a dark-haired man, both smiling at the camera. Because 47 years ago, she said finally, echoing her words from their first real conversation, someone did something similar for me when I needed it most. She returned her attention to the siblings. My husband and I were unable to have children of our own. But over the years, we found that family comes in many forms. Some of them temporary, some permanent, all of them meaningful. Like us? Emma asked. Like you, Ruth confirmed with a gentle smile. And like Scout? Strays who found each other through a series of unlikely events that some might call coincidence, but I prefer to call purpose. Scout, hearing his name, lifted his head and looked between them all, tail thumping against the kitchen floor in a steady rhythm. He really did bring us all together, didn't he? Ethan marveled, reaching down to scratch behind the puppy's ears. If I hadn't found him that night in the park. But you did, Ruth pointed out. That's the story we're living, not the one that might have been. Emma slipped her hand into Ethan's, her smaller fingers wrapping around his with surprising strength. I still can't believe you're really here, she said softly, that you've been alive all this time, looking for me. I never stopped, Ethan told her, squeezing her hand gently. Not for a single day. Ruth rose from the table with the smooth movements of someone accustomed to allowing others their moments of privacy. I think this calls for cookies and milk, she announced. And perhaps we should call the Hendersons to let them know where Emma is and why she might be a bit late coming home today. As Ruth busied herself with glasses and plates, Ethan found himself studying his sister's face, memorizing the changes 3 years had wrought while marveling at what remained the same. The shape of her eyebrows, just like their mother's. The small scar on her chin from falling off her bike at age 5. The way her left dimple appeared before her right when she smiled. You look like Dad, Emma said suddenly, clearly engaged in the same cataloging process. Around the eyes. And you do that thing with your jaw when you're thinking hard, just like he did. You remember that? Ethan asked, surprised. She'd been so young when they lost their parents. Emma nodded solemnly. I remember lots of things. I just didn't let myself think about them much. It hurt too bad. I know, Ethan said softly. Me too. Scout whined softly, sensing the shift in mood, and Emma smiled down at him. It's okay, puppy. We're sad about before, but happy about now. The simple truth of her statement hung in the air between them, a perfect distillation of their shared experience. Sad about before, happy about now. Will you tell me about your life? Emma asked, looking back up at Ethan. Everything that happened since that night? If you'll tell me about yours, Ethan countered gently. Deal. Emma agreed with the solemn certainty only a 9-year-old could muster. But you have to go first. Big brother privilege. The phrase, big brother, sparked something in Ethan's chest, a warmth that spread outward until he felt it might radiate visibly from his skin. He was someone's big brother again. He had a purpose, a role, an identity beyond foster kid. Or orphan. Well, he began, as Ruth set glasses of milk and a plate of cookies between them. It started in the hospital. I woke up with a cast on my arm and no idea what had happened. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the siblings talked, cried, laughed, and began the delicate process of weaving together the separate threads of their lives into something new. Scout moved between them, offering comfort when tears threatened, celebrating with tail wags when laughter broke through. And Ruth watched over them all, this unlikely family assembled by chance and choice, and perhaps a touch of destiny, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, but believing with absolute certainty that they would walk it together. Outside, as dust settled over the neighborhood, lights came on in houses up and down the street, the Shaws, the Hendersons, and all the others who had no idea that a small miracle had occurred among them that day. In Ruth's backyard, the doghouse sat empty, no longer needed as Scout had clearly found his permanent place inside, at the feet of the boy who had rescued him and the girl who had completed their circle. Sometimes the families we make are stronger than the ones we're born into, Ruth thought as she watched Ethan demonstrate to Emma how Scout had learned to give his paw on command. And sometimes they're exactly the same. 3 strays finding home in each other. It wasn't the end of their story, far from it. But it was perhaps the beginning of a new chapter. One written not in loneliness and loss, but in connection, hope, and the quiet miracle of being found when you thought you were irretrievably lost. And all because an orphaned teen had rescued an abandoned puppy on a rainy night in Riverdale Park, never suspecting where that single act of kindness would lead.